World History, Chapter 16, New Nations Emerge. Section 1, The Independent Nations of South Asia. Our learning objective is to analyze the instances of nation building in the contemporary world. Independence brings partition. Local activists in British India had demanded self-rule since the late 1800s. As independence neared, however, a long simmering issue surfaced. What would happen to the Muslim minority in a Hindu-dominated India? Two new nations emerge. Like Gandhi, most of the leaders of the Congress Party were Hindus. However, the party wanted a unified India that included both Muslims and Hindus. The Muslim League feared discrimination and demanded the creation of a separate nation, Pakistan. That included areas of India where Muslims were a majority. Refugees flee amid violence. Once the new borders were known, Hindus in Pakistan fled to India, and Muslims in India fled to Pakistan. There were an estimated 10 million refugees combined. Hindus and Sikhs slaughtered many fleeing Muslims, and Muslims massacred Hindu and Sikh neighbors. About 1 million were killed in these massacres. The struggle for Kashmir. Following independence, India and Pakistan fought a war over Kashmir. They agreed to stop fighting in 1949, but they fought another war in 1965 and have had other clashes since. Nuclear arms. In the 1970s, India and then Pakistan began to develop nuclear weapons. Both conducted successful tests in 1998. The international community continues to be worried about these nuclear rivals. Sri Lanka. And you can see the location of Sri Lanka here. This is an island nation just off the tip of mainland India. In Sri Lanka, Sinhalese Buddhists are the majority, and they attempted to make Sinhalese the official language. They ended the official use of the Tamil language, and they also created government support for the Buddhist religion. Hindu Tamils were excluded from power. This led to a bloody civil war. The Tamil rebels agreed to a ceasefire in 2002, only when the government agreed to negotiate a separate Tamil regional government. Renewed fighting started in 2005, but the Sri Lanka military defeated the rebels in 2009. India. India developed a parliamentary government. Jawaharlal Nehru served as prime minister. And industry flourished in India. After Nehru's death, his daughter, Indira Gandhi, became prime minister in 1966. This is Indira Gandhi, pictured here. India's large population led to problems as many lived in poverty. Religious differences led to conflicts. Militant Sikhs demanded independence for Punjab. The Indian Army opened fire on Sikhs, occupying the Golden Temple, killing thousands of terrorists. Gandhi was assassinated in retaliation in 1984. True or false? Indira Gandhi was selected as the Prime Minister of India in 1966. That is true. India. Rajiv Gandhi became the Prime Minister after his mother's death. He modernized the telecommunications industry, the education system, he expanded science and technology initiatives, and improved relations with the United States. He was assassinated by a Tamil nationalist group. India today. India has the second largest population in the world, over 1.1 billion, and it is the world's largest democracy. India's stability is still threatened by conflict between Hindus and Muslims. Widespread poverty, lack of infrastructure remain challenges for India. These problems are made worse by the rapid population growth. Pakistan and Bangladesh. The separation of East and West Pakistan eventually led to East Pakistan becoming independent and forming Bangladesh in 1971. West Pakistan is now simply known as Pakistan. Both nations have had difficulty establishing stable governments. Here you can have a look at a map, and what you see here, here is India, here is neighboring Pakistan, what was once known as West Pakistan, and then over here you see the region known as Bangladesh, which was once East Pakistan. And so you can see when this split took place and Pakistan became separate from India, the two portions of Pakistan were separated geographically from each other, and that ultimately led to this difference where they felt there was a need to separate. And Bangladesh became a separate country from Pakistan. So true or false? East Pakistan declared its independence from West Pakistan in 1971. That also is true. Pakistan. Pakistan has struggled with instability due to religious conflict. Pakistan supported the Taliban, the former ruling government in Afghanistan, but when the U.S. went to war in Afghanistan, they supported the United States. Pakistan has been a U.S. ally in the war on terror. However, the U.S. has captured or killed several high-ranking al-Qaeda leaders hiding in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden had been living for some time in a large compound in Abbottabad, which is home to the Pakistani military. And what you see here, this is looks like a computer-generated model of the compound that Osama bin Laden was living in, and it was very distinctive. And of course, this raises issues as to Pakistan's involvement or support of Osama bin Laden. Was the government aware that he was there? We certainly think that some military officials were. And any way you cut it, it kind of looks bad for Pakistan in that either they were complicit in hiding bin Laden, or they were incompetent in not knowing that he was there, being that this structure really stood out from everything else in the area and was so close to their military home. I mean, this is basically the equivalent of their West Point. And so certainly we believe that there were some in Pakistan that were complicit. However, the fact that the United States went in and took out Osama bin Laden without informing the Pakistani government beforehand also increased tensions between the United States and Pakistan, and it kind of becomes a delicate issue. Section 2, New Nations of Southeast Asia. Start with the Philippines. The United States annexed the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Now, of course, this goes back roughly about 100 years ago. The Spanish-American War, took place right around the turn of the century, and then, we annexed the Philippines, and the Filipino rebels fought the United States for independence. That battle went on for 3 years. But the U.S. defeated the rebels. On July 4th, 1946, the U.S. granted full independence to the Philippines. And of course, this is just right after the end of World War II that we finally granted them their full independence. Emilio Aguinaldo was the first president of the Philippines. Now, he was also kind of the leader of the rebels that initially fought alongside the United States and later ended up fighting against the United States. He became their first president. Ferdinand Marcos ruled from 1965 until he was forced from office in 1986. Corazon Aquino became president in 1986 and worked for democratic reforms. Burma, also known now as Myanmar, was granted independence by Great Britain in 1948, just shortly after World War II. They were a democratic republic from 1948 to 1962, but they've had military rule since 1962. Today, they are considered one of the worst abusers of human rights. The country was devastated by a cyclone in 2008, and the government hindered relief efforts from the United Nations. Malaysia. Malaya gained independence from Great Britain in 1957. In 1963, they formed a union with Singapore, British North Borneo, and Sarawak, forming the Federation of Malaysia. It is a federal, constitutional, elective monarchy, and it has seen tremendous economic growth since the 1980s. Here's a look at the Petronas Towers, which are located in the capital of Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. And these were the world's tallest buildings between 1998 and 2004. Since then, of course, they've been surpassed. Indonesia was ruled by the Netherlands. International pressure resulted in independence in 1949. Sukarno became the first president of Indonesia. Sukarno shifted the government more towards an authoritarian government. General Suharto became president in 1968. He encouraged direct foreign investment, and the economy made gains. Suharto was accused of corruption, and he resigned in 1998, and in 2004, the first direct presidential election was held. Thailand. Thailand is kind of a rarity when we look at Southeast Asia because they were never colonized. It is a constitutional monarchy. Thailand has an emerging economy and is a newly industrialized country. Vietnam. Vietnam was first conquered by the Chinese, and it became a French colonial possession. Along with Cambodia and Laos, it made up what was known as French Indochina. Now, of course, during World War II, France is overrun in Europe, so the Japanese gained control during this time period. And so Japan, they kind of made this part of their kind of great Asian empire, and they also began to pull out a lot of the rice, leading to the starvation of millions, as rice was the basic staple of which the Vietnamese people, many of them survived on, and they were taking that as an export crop. So that bred a lot of resentment against the Japanese, and eventually led to Ho Chi Minh, who was a Vietnamese nationalist and a communist for that matter, to ally himself with the United States during World War II while they fought the Japanese. So here's a look at Ho Chi Minh, as I said, a nationalist and a communist. He led a group known as the Viet Minh to fight the Japanese. And Ho assisted the U.S. during World War II. After the war, after World War II, the French returned, and Ho fought the French to achieve an independent Vietnam. The war ends. After the French were defeated, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. A civil war ensued between North and South, and the U.S. supported the South as they were not communist. The U.S. withdrew in 1973, and North Vietnam overran South Vietnam in 1975. After 30 years of war, Vietnam was reunified with a communist government. The boat people. Many South Vietnamese attempted to flee Vietnam, fearing that they would be killed by the communists. Many fled the communist regime by boat, giving rise to the term boat people. Here's a look at the Vietnam War casualties. About 58,000 Americans were killed, and an estimated 3 million Vietnamese were killed over the course of this 30-year war. Vietnam today. The trade embargo was lifted in 1994. It has most favored nation trading status with the United States, and it also has full diplomatic relations with the United States. Laos. Laos, which is a landlocked country neighboring Vietnam, became independent of France in 1954. Laos also became involved in the Vietnam War. After a civil war, the Pathet Lao gained control, and the Pathet Lao are a communist group. Today, Laos is a single-party communist country. Cambodia. They became independent of France in 1953. It too was involved in the Vietnam War. The Khmer Rouge, which basically means Khmer, which is a people group who were communist, and Rouge meaning red, which we associate with communism. So basically the Khmer Communist, Khmer Rouge, seized power in 1975. Pol Pot, this is Pol Pot up here at the top, seized power, and he was the leader of the Khmer Rouge. They tried to make an agrarian-based society, meaning they wanted to really return to agriculture. They wanted a very simplified society in which everybody relied upon agriculture. So city dwellers were deported to the countryside and were subject to forced labor in these forced labor camps. And then, many people they considered to be the intellectual elite, those people with an education, or quite frankly, even sometimes people who looked smart. If you wore glasses, you were likely to be a target of the Khmer Rouge because glasses made you look smart, so they assumed you were. And an estimated 1.5 million were tortured and killed. The educated and the intellectual elite were especially targeted. And one of the sites at which many of these took place was at the S-21 prison. This was a former high school, and today it is the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, which is a museum in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. The site is a former high school which was used as the notorious security prison 21 or S-21 by the Khmer Rouge regime from its rise to power in 1975 to its fall in 1979. The Khmer Rouge was overthrown with the help of Vietnam in 1979. Today, Cambodia is a multi-party democracy under a constitutional monarchy. And the poster you see here is for the movie The Killing Fields, which came out about 1984, I believe, or 83, somewhere right in there. Kind of early to mid-80s. And one of the stars in the movie actually played himself in the movie, and he was somebody who was a victim of the Khmer Rouge. He was sent to those forced labor camps, working out in the fields, and the movie largely kind of tells his story along with the paths of several journalists that he crossed paths with. Very good movie. Also stars Sam Waterston and John Malkovich. So that's Cambodia. Section 3, African nations gain independence. Here's a look at the ethno-linguistic groups in Africa. So you can see there's many different, as we look at the diversity, many different ethno-linguistic groups. Every shade here represents a different ethno-linguistic group. So there's many different ethno-linguistic groups on the African continent. And over here we have a look, this is a political map, or political look at the political boundaries of Africa. So looking at Africa today, it currently has 54 sovereign nations. It is the largest continent geographically. Conflict and corruption are common. There are over 1,000 different languages. African independence. World War II weakened European colonial empires, and many local leaders began to push for independence after the war. After World War II, most nations in Africa gained independence from colonial rule. Significant political, economic, and health challenges face most newly independent nations. Many dictators have fallen. Apartheid ended in South Africa in 1994, and many nations struggle with instability and cultural conflicts. Here we have a look at Ghana. The British colony of Gold Coast, as it was once known, became the first British colony to gain independence in 1957. Led by Kwame Nkrumah, it was renamed Ghana, and Nkrumah supported Pan-Africanism, which would be kind of a union of all black African nations. Kenya. The Mau Mau uprising was a military conflict that took place between 1952 and 1960. It involved a Kikuyu-dominated anti-colonial group called Mau Mau and elements of the British Army, auxiliaries, and the anti-Mau Mau Kikuyu. So in effect, you've got this two Kikuyu groups that are a part of this. They've kind of got a civil war, but on one side you also have the elements of the British Army and auxiliaries sided with them against a Kikuyu-dominated anti-colonial group that's opposed to British colonization of Kenya. The British killed thousands in response to the uprising. Jomo Kenyatta was arrested in October of 1952 and indicted with 5 others on the charges of managing and being a member of the Mau Mau Society. This is Jomo Kenyatta pictured here. Finally, Kenya became independent of Great Britain on December 12, 1963, and Jomo Kenyatta became the first Prime Minister and first President. Senegal. They became independent from France in 1960, and Leopold Senghor became the first president. This is him pictured here. Tanzania. Tanzania gained its independence in the early 1960s. It has been very poor since gaining independence, with half of its population living below the poverty line. It practiced African socialism modeled after the African village traditions of cooperation and shared responsibility. They tried to get farmers to give up their land and farm collectively. The efforts failed as many farmers refused to give up their land. The socialism resulted in a huge bureaucracy, and by the mid-1980s, the nation was heavily in debt. This brought about numerous reforms, and a shift to a free market economy and direct foreign investment was encouraged. Today, Tanzania remains mostly agricultural, as about 90% of the workforce works in agriculture, and over half of the nation's GDP is from agriculture. In the 2000s, the nation has received a boost from foreign investment and a large gold mine. Somalia. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Somalia's then socialist government abandoned alliances with its former partner, the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union supported the new communist of Ethiopia, who Somalia was at war with. Somalia had to seek allies elsewhere. It eventually settled on the Soviet Union's Cold War rival, the United States. Somalia's initial friendship with the Soviet Union and later military support by the United States enabled it to build the largest army on the continent. The Battle of Mogadishu. The Battle of Mogadishu, more commonly referred to as Black Hawk Down, was fought on October 3rd and 4th, 1993 in Mogadishu, Somalia, between forces of the United States and Somali militia fighters loyal to the self-proclaimed president-to-be Mohammed Farah Aidid, who had the support from armed civilian fighters. During the operation, 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters were shot down by RPGs, or rocket-propelled grenades, and 3 others were damaged. Some of the wounded survivors were able to evacuate back to the compound, but others remained near the crash sites and were isolated. An urban battle ensued throughout the night. 18 Americans were killed, and their bodies were dragged through the streets. New nations. Most leaders in the new nations are from the urban middle class and have been educated in the West. Most favor democratic governments and have had to pursue democratic governments to get loans. Some favored capitalism, while others favored an African form of socialism. And here's a look at some of the different countries and when they gained independence. So you can see Cameroon, which had been colonized by both France and Britain, received its independence January 1st, 1960. Libya, who had been colonized by Italy, they became independent on the 24th of December, 1951. Somalia, which, once again, there were two parts, colonized by Italy and Britain. So you had Italian Somaliland and British Somaliland. Both gained independence on the 1st of July, 1960. Equatorial Guinea, which belonged to Spain, also had previously been known as Spanish Guinea, received its independence on the 12th of October, 1968. Pan-Africanism, once again, that's the unity of all black Africans, regardless of national boundaries, something that Kwame Nkrumah had supported. The Organization of African Unity formed, and the OAU has helped to settle border disputes. If we look at some of the causes of this, the independence. First of all, long-term causes, European powers colonized most of Africa. Short-term causes, World War II weakens European colonial empires. During the decade after World War II, Africans increasingly demand independence, and skilled speakers and organizers lead independence movements. Some liberation struggles turn violent. The results of this are African states achieve independence. The effects, ethnic and regional conflicts plague many African nations. The dictators seize power in many African nations. Superpowers jostle for influence in Africa during the Cold War, and some African nations move toward democracy. And here's a look at a cartoon depicting Africa after independence. So you can see it says heavy French responsibility in Africa. So here you can see they're kind of weighted down as they're crossing a rickety bridge with alligators left below, and so kind of basically telling us that Europe's kind of walking in dangerous territory after African independence. Things aren't very stable. Now we turn to section 4, the modern Middle East. First of all, we'll take a quick look at the geography of the Middle East. The Middle East is not a country, nor is it a continent. It is a region that encompasses parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia. So it's really a part. It's a geographic area or a region that we recognize, but it's parts of 3 different continents and many different countries. The bodies of water, looking at the major bodies of water we have here, there's the Mediterranean Sea, which you can picture right here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. It really kind of separates Europe from North Africa. The Black Sea, that's right up here, just north of Turkey, borders along Russia and Romania and Bulgaria. The Caspian Sea, which you see over here, once again borders with Russia and Iran in the south. The Persian Gulf, we see down here, just below Iran, and just kind of above Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula. And this goes right through the Gulf of Oman, out into the Arabian Sea, which also, of course, we see down here. Another major body of water there. The Nile River, which runs down south from the Mediterranean, through Egypt and the Sudan. It is the longest river in the world. The Dead Sea, which is located over in this area here. And we also have, I've already mentioned the Gulf of Oman. There's the Gulf of Aden, which is right down here. the Tigris River, and the Euphrates River. And that was basically flows through modern-day Iraq. It was ancient Mesopotamia, which literally means the land between the two rivers. And those two river systems are right here. So those are your major bodies of water in the Middle East. Here's a look at the Nile River. The Nile River, once again, is 4,100 miles long. The distance from San Francisco to New York on Interstate 80 is 2,960 miles. Just to kind of put that into some kind of a perspective. Okay, so literally, if you hopped on I-80 in San Francisco, you could drive, staying on I-80 all the way across the United States, all the way to New York City, and that distance is 2,906 miles. The Nile River is more than, or is over 4,100 miles long. So, we're talking really about another 1,200 miles longer. So that's a pretty significant distance for the Nile River. This is the Aswan High Dam, which was built in the 1960s to control annual flooding on the Nile River. And here's a look at the Nile River Delta. 95% of the population of Egypt lives on only 5% of the land, and most of that is in the Nile River Delta. Here's a look at the Suez Canal, which was built by the British in 1869. And looking at Mesopotamia, once again, land between the rivers is really what that means. So here you see the Tigris River, and then down below the Euphrates River. Both of them are in modern-day Iraq, but what was ancient Babylonia. And here's a look at some marsh Arabs in Iraq. Once again, the Dead Sea. See that right here, located in, kind of really between Israel and Jordan. And, what we have here is this is the lowest point on Earth. It is 423 meters, or roughly 1,388 feet below sea level. The salinity is 33.7%. If you don't know what that means, that's basically the salt content of the water. And because it is so high, if you look at this person, they're floating on their back. There's no floating device. They're just floating in the water. And that's due to the salinity. That high salt content makes it possible for people to quite literally float in that water, as you see this guy doing, sitting there reading a newspaper. Not at all an uncommon sight in the Dead Sea. Here's a look at some of the mountains in the Middle East. You have the Taurus Mountains, which you see right here. You have the Elburz Mountains right here. The Zagros Mountains right here, and the Hindu Kush Mountains right here. And this right here, the Hindu Kush, falls really right on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this is where the United States, during their war in Afghanistan against the Taliban, has really largely been fighting against the Taliban right along the Hindu Kush mountain range. Deserts in the Middle East. The Sahara Desert in North Africa, you see pictured here. The Sinai Desert, which this is the Sinai Peninsula, so you've also got the Sinai Desert located there. And you also have the Arabian Desert, also on the Arabian Peninsula. You see that down here. And Rub al-Khali, also known as the Empty Quarter. Here's a look at desert Bedouins, or dwellers. And desert locusts can be a major problem in the area. As you can see, what the plagues of locusts look like. Freshwater resources. Freshwater is very scarce in the Middle East. And so, in fact, they actually have many which you would call desalinization plants that are designed to remove the salt from water to make salt water usable. So this is an example of a desalinization plant. This one is located in Dubai. Desalinization plants in the Middle East remove salt from the seawater to produce fresh water. Land use. Here you see what's called or referred to as the Fertile Crescent. And that's really because it basically bears a more or less crescent shape. And this is really the region that is the most fertile land. And here you can see a look at the land use in terms of, cropland, which that's more the kind of goldish color, and most of that would fall in this Fertile Crescent. You can also see crop and livestock, pasture and livestock. The purple is nomadic livestock herding, and nomadic livestock, the difference there is that, nomadic herders don't really, it's not like ranching. They actually follow their herds. So they're on the move. They don't have a permanent dwelling spot. You also have forest, where you see the green, and there are more isolated pockets in here. Oasis, where you see the blue, and the really light blue represents what we would call non-agricultural land. So large parts, mostly in the desert, just not any good for farming of any kind or any type of agriculture. Population density. The purple are areas with over 250 people per square mile. I'm sorry, make that 260 people per square mile in the purple. Between 130 and 260 people in the more dark red areas. The slightly lighter red areas, population would be between 25 and 130 people square mile. The much lighter, or the lighter still, is going to be, let's see if I can find this here. Okay, so here's the purple. Here's the next highest population density, moving down, getting lower. You get into these these lighter colors. This one right here would be between 3 and 25 people per square mile, and these really light, almost yellow areas are areas where the population density is less than 3 people per square mile. Now, of course, that you may obviously find some areas, that's an average. You may find some areas where within a square mile there may be more living, but they're pretty sparsely populated out in these areas because to be honest, the land won't support much. Now, we look here at the top oil producers. And so these are proven oil reserves by country in barrels. So here you have Nigeria, Libya, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Canada, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia. And this is from the World Factbook from January 1st, 2011. So what you can see is, Nigeria, that's on the African continent. Libya is on the African continent, but they are considered part of the Middle East. Russia, of course, is not part of the Middle East. The United Arab Emirates is. Kuwait is. Iraq and Iran both are. Canada and Venezuela are not, but Saudi Arabia is. And Saudi Arabia does have the world's largest proven oil reserves, and this is in barrels once again. So you can see there, they've got billions of barrels, 262 billion, 600 million proven barrels of oil. So that's what that looks like. So you can see obviously why oil is so important in there to that area, to that region. Now, looking at the major religions of the Middle East. Most of the people in the Middle East are Muslims, but there are also Christian communities and the predominantly Jewish nation of Israel. Most countries also have large ethnic or religious minorities. And so if you look here at this map, this depicts, once again by shade, the different religious groups. So the dark red are Christian groups. You don't find too much. There is a little bit right over in here. You see a little pocket of the dark red, which are an area where there's a large Christian population. Druze in the green, kind of a rare religious group. The purple are Jewish, which you're going to find that mostly right here in the nation of Israel. Sunni Muslim and Shia Muslim. The Sunni is in the lighter colored regions, and the Shia Muslim are in the darker colored regions. And once again, that's by majority. There are, of course, in some of these areas, you may have both Sunni and Shia, but one may be a majority, the other minority. Colonialism. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed during the First World War, the League of Nations dispersed much of the former Ottoman territory to France and Great Britain to rule them as mandates, to prepare them for independence. That was the idea behind the mandate system. It wasn't that they were really supposed to rule them as colonies. They were supposed to be preparing these countries to become independent, but ultimately it really worked out to be more like colonialism. Okay, so here we have a look at the League of Nations mandates. The League of Nations mandate system left many countries feeling bitter, especially in the Middle East. And once again, that's because largely, for the most part, these mandates were ruled in the Middle East as if they were colonies. Industrialized nations have had increased interest in the region since the discovery of oil, which ultimately that leads to particularly France and Britain, along with other industrial powers, looking to exploit the oil resources of the Middle East. And here we have a look at the Kurdish people. They're an ethnic group that were divided by borders drawn by Europeans. So once again, this goes back into that time period, end of World War I. The League of Nations, in their mandates, they begin to divide up the Middle East, and they didn't necessarily look at the different nationalist groups. In some cases, they somewhat ignored them, and that was really the case with Kurdistan, which was a region in which the Kurdish people live, but instead they divided up into these other borders, and this ends up making the Kurds a minority group in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Now, the reality is that Kurdistan is really in itself a region. Kurdistan is a nation. The Kurdish people live in the nation of Kurdistan. But because of these borders being drawn up the way they were, they end up becoming a small minority in these other countries, and they face discrimination, especially in Turkey and in Iraq. And we'll talk more about particularly what happened in Iraq when we look at modern Iraq. The birth of Israel. The creation of the State of Israel. In 1917, Great Britain supported a Jewish homeland in the Mandate of Palestine. After the Holocaust, there was widespread support for this concept. On May 14, 1948, the day before the expiration of the Mandate of Palestine, David Ben-Gurion declared the creation of the State of Israel. Within days, Israel was attacked by several of its Arab neighbors. Kibbutz. The Arab-Israeli conflicts have forced 700,000 Palestinians from their homes. Despite the conflicts, Israel has developed rapidly due to a skilled workforce. Kibbutzim work on what is called a kibbutz, or a collective farm. Religion.
Some Middle Eastern countries have adopted secular or non-religious government and laws. However, many Muslim leaders argue that a renewed commitment to Islamic doctrine is needed. Some have turned to violence and acts of terror, while others object to the use of these means. Women. Women's rights vary greatly from one nation to another. In Iran and Saudi Arabia, women are required to wear the hijab, or traditional Muslim garments. These are the head coverings. Now, the hijab can be a lot more restrictive, or in some cases less restrictive. So, if you look here, for example, this woman's just kind of got the headscarf on, not near as restrictive as when you look here. For example, this woman, only her eyes are left exposed. And even in some countries, I've seen like a mesh that covers the eyes. Now let's look at Egypt. Egypt, the most populous Arab country, is important because it controls the Suez Canal. Thus, that it really controls a lot of the vital shipping that goes through there, particularly the shipping lanes that would take oil from the Middle East into Europe. Under Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt fought 2 unsuccessful wars against Israel. Anwar Sadat. Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, made peace with Israel. And this happened during the historic Camp David Accords, brokered by then U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Islamists were angry about government corruption and the failure to end poverty. In 1981, Sadat was assassinated by Muslim fundamentalists. Hosni Mubarak. After Sadat was assassinated, Hosni Mubarak came to power. Mubarak was supported by the United States for many years as he supported U.S. policy in the Middle East and was a stabilizing force in the region. Corruption and brutal suppression of critics eventually led to him being toppled in the Egyptian Revolution in 2011. Now, moving on to look at modern Iran, 1951 to today. Here's a map of Iran. And here we have a look at Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran. So he became Prime Minister in 1951, and he nationalized the foreign oil companies. What that means is that these foreign-owned or controlled oil companies were taken over by the Iranian government. He got rid of corrupt military officials, but he was toppled in a coup that was aided by the American CIA in 1953. Now, a lot of Americans really knew little of the Middle East, didn't know much about Iran, and was not even aware that he had been toppled by a coup aided by the CIA. The Shah of Iran returns to power. And here we have a look at Shah Reza Pahlavi. He reigned from 1941 to 1979, of course, except for the brief period where Mohammad Mossadegh was the prime minister. The Shah instituted Western reforms and had strong ties to the West. The majority of Iranians lived in poverty, while he led a life of extravagance. He used the secret police, called the Savak, to maintain control. And once again, he was supported by the U.S. In fact, the United States actually went to great lengths to keep using the CIA to help prevent a coup, to make sure that they kept him in power, because they were fearful of Russian influence in Iran. They felt like Mossadegh was becoming too friendly with the Soviet Union, and of course this is during the Cold War, as the Cold War is heating up. So by inserting the Western-friendly Shah, that was seen as a victory in the Cold War. The White Revolution, the Shah's 1963 reform program. These are some of the things that were a part of the White Revolution. 1, land reform. They began abolishing feudalism. 2, nationalization of forest and pasture lands. 3, privatization of the government-owned enterprises. 4, profit sharing. 5, women's suffrage. 6, formation of literacy corps and health corps. Nationalization of resources. Urban and rural modernization and reconstruction. Price stabilization. Free and compulsory education. Free food for needy mothers. Introduction of Social Security. And here we have a look at the Shah with some different U.S. presidents. So on the left, you see him meeting with then President John F. Kennedy. And here he is with then President Richard M. Nixon. And over here, we see him pictured as well with then President Jimmy Carter. And here we have a depiction in a cartoon of the Shah, of course, kissing Jimmy Carter's hand. And then here, once again, is another picture of the Shah with President Carter and the Shah's wife, Farah, with Carter's wife, Rosalind. Then, 1979, the Iranian Revolution starts. Oil profits squandered on personal luxuries and on American military hardware, while little was reinvested into the economy, helped lead to this Iranian Revolution. As well, religious leaders are angry over too much Western influence. Government corruption, and another thing that irritated many people in Iran was the brutal suppression of dissidents. And dissidents, once again, are people that speak out against the government. So eventually, the Shah flees. He fled Iran on January 16, 1979. The Ayatollah Khomeini returns from exile. Khomeini returns to Iran on February 11, 1979, and leads the revolution and the nation. So, the Ayatollah Khomeini is a religious scholar in the Muslim faith, and he really became the spiritual leader in Iran. But he had been a critic of the Shah, and so as a result, he had been deported and was living in France. And then after the Shah flees, that frees him to return home. And so he returns and then becomes the leader, not only of the faith, but also becomes a leader of the country. In effect, he's ruling as almost like a king or like a monarch. I mean, he really pretty much has complete power as the supreme religious leader. So here are some details on him. He's believed to have been born in 1902. He died in 1989. He became an Islamic scholar and studied in the city of Qom. Once again, critical of the Shah, deported to Turkey in 1965, later moved to Najaf, Iraq, and then was forced to leave in 1978 by the new Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein, and that's when he moves to France and then is able to return home shortly thereafter to his native Iran. So, after the revolution, this shows the fate of the Shah's generals. So, you have a couple pictures here. Here you can see the Shah's generals, and here are their bodies in the morgue, morgue photos. The Shah's generals were placed on trial and executed just days after the fall of the monarchy. This leads us now into the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran becomes a theocracy ruled by Sharia law. Now, Sharia law is a type of Islamic law. It's part of the Islamic religious faith, and it becomes the basis of the Iranian government. So there is no separation of church and state. Unlike here in the United States, where we elect the president is really technically free to have whatever religious beliefs he wants. But the government does not recognize a particular religion in the United States. But in Iran, this is the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are now an Islamic nation ruled by an Islamic government. And of course the Shah becomes the supreme leader, which makes him the highest power in the nation. Then, protesters overtake the American embassy. So, throughout 1979, protests continue not only against the Shah, but against the United States. And that's largely ignored by most Americans. The media doesn't really cover it. It's not really seen as a big deal. But then on November 4th, 1979, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, which is the capital, is overrun by protesters who take 52 Americans hostage. And they demand that the Shah be returned to face charges. Now, initially, many of the hostage takers believed that this was going to be a fairly short, hostage situation where they were just going to make a statement, get a message across. It might last for a day or two. The whole thing ends up dragging on for more than a year. Also, at the time that these hostages are taken, some Americans, a small group, managed to escape. And they just kind of basically go out a back door out of the embassy, slip out into the street, and kind of disappear. Later, they end up coming to be housed by Canadian diplomats in Iran, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So, all in all, 52 Americans are held hostage for 444 days. Here you see a very well-known photo of the crisis. So these are some of the American hostages blindfolded here by their hostage takers. And this picture here is from a news broadcast. This is Ted Koppel reporting. And you can see from the graphic in the background, it was day 100 of the Iranian hostage crisis. And this was something that we got very used to. Every night we got updates on the nightly news, and they kept reminding us, well, this is, day 100, day 101, day 102, and so on, of the Iranian hostage crisis. So it kept it very fresh in the public's minds. This also happens to be, as we move into the year of 1980, there's a presidential election. And quite literally, the hostage crisis started exactly 1 year to the day before the election. Our elections here in the United States, our presidential elections, are always held in November on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And for 1980, that first Tuesday after the first Monday fell on November 4th, literally 1 year after the hostage crisis, which started November 4th, 1979. So, quite literally, for that whole year leading up to the election, Jimmy Carter, who was president, has to deal with this crisis. So the hostage crisis, once again, it started exactly 1 year before the 1980 presidential election. Most experts believe that Carter's inability to gain the release of the hostages destroyed his chance for re-election. Now, there were some other issues. There was a stagnant economy in the United States, but this really was probably seen as being the primary issue that hurt him. And of course, here you can see he ran against Ronald Reagan, who would win the election. So once again, campaign poster and campaign button pictured here. So Reagan would win that election and then would go on to win re-election in 1984. Now, as this thing continued to drag on, finally Carter authorized a rescue attempt. And this attempt would take place in April of 1980. But the attempt ran into numerous problems and it was called off. A rescue helicopter collided with a transport aircraft in the Iranian desert, killing 8 service members. Operation Eagle Claw was the code name of this operation. And here you can see some Iranians, including one of the mullahs, or religious leaders, overlooking the crash site. Six Americans are rescued. Those Americans that I mentioned had slipped out into the street and kind of disappeared and ended up staying with Canadian diplomats. These are the 6 that end up being rescued. So, once again, as I said, they escaped from the embassy during the takeover and were hid by Canadian ambassadors. They were eventually rescued in a secret mission that was carried out by the CIA and their Canadian hosts. The rescue was depicted in the 2012 Academy Award-winning movie Argo, starring Ben Affleck. And this really, pretty well documents the way in which they put together or created a fake movie to be shot over there that was the justification for why they were supposedly there, and used fake passports to get these 6 Americans out. So, finally, the hostages are released. The 52 Americans were released on January 20th, 1981, after 444 days in captivity. As a final insult to President Carter, the hostages left Iranian airspace about 30 minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in. Ronald Reagan got to be the one to make the announcement. The Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988. So Saddam Hussein comes to power in Iraq, and we have the Iranian hostage crisis that takes place starts in 1979, carries into 1980, and eventually into 1981. During 1980, the Iran-Iraq War started, so Iran is quite literally at war with Iraq before those hostages do end up being released. Now here's a look at the global map, looking at the countries that were taking sides in the Iran-Iraq War. So the countries that you see that are colored in red are countries that provided military support to Iraq. The countries in the bright green provided military support to Iran. The countries in the dark green provided military support to both sides. And so you can see the United States, Brazil, the Soviet Union, and China, for example, were all 3 countries that provided military aid to both sides in this war. As far as war casualties, in Iran, somewhere between 300,000 and 900,000 soldiers and militia were killed. The economic loss of more than 500 billion US dollars. In Iraq, 150,000 to 375,000 soldiers and militia were killed. The economic loss of more than $500 billion and 100,000 civilian casualties on each side. Here's a look at Khomeini's death, June of 1989. Here you can see as many in Iran were trying to get close to the body and touch the body of the Ayatollah. Really a pretty chaotic scene. And here we have a look at the Iranian Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He became the Supreme Leader of Iran after Khomeini's death, and he holds the real power in Iran. And he represents the fundamentalist mullahs. And here we have a look at the former Iranian president, which the president is the second highest office in Iran, and the president acts as the head of state. And here we see Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who had been the president since 2005, and really became a controversial leader. And now he just recently, he was ineligible to run for another term, and was just replaced in 2013. But some of the things that made Ahmadinejad so controversial is that he denied that the Holocaust, and he denied that it ever happened. He made threats against Israel and has been hostile towards the U.S. As I said, he was re-elected in 2009, but then ineligible to run again in 2013. The 2009 election was controversial. As I mentioned, like I said, term limits made it impossible for him to run again. The new leader, fortunately, seems to be, thus far, more reasonable and more willing to work with the international community. A nuclear power. It is believed that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, although they claim that their nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. They have faced strict sanctions from the United Nations. And here's a quote. This quote comes from the Council on Foreign Relations President Richard Haass, discussing the potential ramifications in the Middle East should Iran develop nuclear weapons. He says, a nuclear-armed Iran, quote, would place this region on a knife's edge. It would take the most dangerous, unstable part of the world and place it on steroids, unquote. And here is a quote from the Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy Deputy Research Director Dmitry Suslov, questioning the potential for success of a new Russian plan aimed at restarting dialogue over Iran's disputed atomic activities. He says, Iran will pursue its usual policy, whereby it will superficially accept the step-by-step proposal, but in the end, it will refuse to abide by it. For years, Iran has been following this policy, and so far, this policy has suited Iran. Once again, new direction. Hassan Rouhani was elected president in 2013. Although he is considered a political moderate, it is too early to tell how his election will affect U.S.-Iranian relations, although there are reasons for some optimism. And now we will look at Saddam Hussein and modern Iraq. The Kingdom of Iraq. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations gave control over Iraq to Great Britain under the Mandate system. France, which ruled Syria under the Mandate system, had kicked out their king Faisal. Britain made Faisal the first king of Iraq. Iraq was granted independence in 1932. Political instability. Iraq went through a period of instability between 1936 and 1941, experiencing several military coups. A pro-Nazi government gained control in 1941, leading to the Anglo-Iraqi War, which re-established British control. 1945 to 1958. After the Anglo-Iraqi War ended, Nuri as-Said returned as prime minister and dominated the politics of Iraq until the overthrow of the monarchy and his assassination in 1958. Nuri as-Said pursued a largely pro-Western policy during this period. The 1958 revolution. The monarchy is overthrown in a violent coup led by Abd al-Karim Qasem, who became president of the Republic of Iraq. Qasem purged Western advisors and centralized authority. The Ba'ath Party is formed. The Ba'ath Party is formed in 1952. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr led a coup in 1963, possibly backed by the CIA. The Ba'ath Party took control, but was later forced out due to factionalism. They regained control in another coup in 1968. And here we have a look at future dictator Saddam Hussein, who was born in 1937 and died in 2006. Saddam was born in Tikrit, joined the Ba'ath Party in 1957 at the age of 20. In 1959, he was involved in a failed assassination plot on Qasem, and was a cousin of al-Bakr, and served as al-Bakr's deputy and then vice president. Saddam Hussein becomes president. In 1979, Hussein forced al-Bakr to step down, and Hussein became president. He ruled during the Iran-Iraq War and was a brutal dictator. One of the many things he did is he created a cult of personality, which you can kind of see depicted here. There were numerous murals that he had painted around town, actually all around the country, numerous statues in his honor. He quite literally had thousands of portraits, posters, statues, and murals erected in his honor all over Iraq. And his face could be seen on the sides of office buildings, schools, airports, and shops, as well as on the Iraqi currency. The Al-Anfal campaign. Operation Anfal was a genocide against the Kurdish people and other non-Arabs in northern Iraq. The genocide included the use of poison gas on the village of Halaljabad. And of course here you can see some small children that were killed in that gas attack. And this is a look at the man really responsible for carrying out those attacks. Ali Hassan al-Majid, commonly referred to in the West as Chemical Ali. And here's a quote from him: "I will kill them all with chemical weapons." The Persian Gulf War, 1990 to 1991. What touches this off is that on August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. So Iraq invades the U.S. ally and oil-rich nation of Kuwait. The United Nations authorizes the use of force against Iraq. U.S. President George H.W. Bush build support for a coalition of forces. Now, ultimately, what happens is they give Saddam Hussein a deadline and tell him, if you don't withdraw your forces by this point in time, we are going to invade. The Persian Gulf War. Iraq was given until January 15, 1991 to withdraw their forces from Kuwait. The deadline passed, and on the 17th of January, Operation Desert Storm began with an air war followed by a ground invasion. And here are some photos of Operation Desert Storm. And here you can see the map. So this little tiny nation here is Kuwait. This is Iraq. This is neighboring Saudi Arabia. Saddam lobs Scud missiles. Iraq was equipped with Scud missiles, and during the course of this campaign, and one of the things that was interesting about this war here in the United States is that it really represented the first live television war. They say Vietnam was the first television war where we had nightly reports on the news that kind of brought the war home into people's living rooms. But this is the first time, really, thanks to satellite technology, that we were getting live video feed from different countries. And so during this time, we began to see many of these cities that were attacked. Many Scud missiles were lobbed in at Israel, and they also frequently hit major cities in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was part of the coalition forces and actually let the United States use their air bases to launch the air attack against Iraq. And here you see a look at then President George H.W. Bush riding in a vehicle with then General Norman Schwarzkopf in Iraq. And really the whole war becomes a pretty big success. Kuwait is liberated. It doesn't take very long. The ground war barely gets started before it's wrapped up, seen as being a huge success. This is a photograph of what became known as the Highway of Death. The highway from Kuwait City to Basra had been used by Iraqi divisions invading Kuwait. On the night of February 26th and 27, 1991, U.S. and Canadian forces pounded Iraqi vehicles, retreating on the highway. The images of the devastation is one of the reasons why President Bush declared a ceasefire only 100 hours after the ground campaign had started. So, in this aftermath, the ceasefire goes into effect, really not very far into this ground war. And the coalition forces established 2 no-fly zones in Iraq after the war. Now, these no-fly zones were put in by UN resolution, and Saddam Hussein did violate these, but what you can see is there were 2 no-fly zones, one up in the north near Mosul, and then one down below, so one basically above the 36th parallel, one below the 36th parallel, and then the area where they could fly was in here in between. The zones were designed to protect the Kurds in the north and the Shiite Muslims in the south. So these were 2 groups that could easily be targeted by Saddam Hussein. In between the wars, in the 1998 State of the Union address, Clinton mentioned that Saddam Hussein was trying to develop nuclear weapons. Clinton ordered airstrikes against Iraqi targets in the no-fly zone. For the last 2 years of Clinton's presidency, we routinely hit targets in the no-fly zone. Now this brings us to the Iraq War of 2003 through 2011. So, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, who was president when we first went to war in the Persian Gulf in 1991. He becomes president, and U.S. President George Bush made the case for going to war in Iraq, saying that Saddam Hussein had kicked out UN weapons inspectors, which was true, he had, which of course added to this growing suspicion that he was developing nuclear weapons. The argument was he was making weapons of mass destruction. Now, generally, WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, refers to nuclear weapons. However, you could also include chemical and biological weapons as well, sometimes would be grouped into that category as being WMDs. Also, another argument is he was a brutal dictator, which that he was, and he had already used chemical weapons in Iran against the Kurds, which that of course was true. He fully developed WMDs, or if he fully developed WMDs, he might use them against other nations, including the United States. So the argument was that we needed to make a preemptive strike, even though that's not generally what we do here in the United States. So ultimately, we agreed. Congress gave the president the approval. We went to war in Iraq, and we began with a campaign that was referred to as shock and awe, where we literally, the coalition forces pounded Baghdad, which is of course the nation's capital, and they pounded that over and over again. Now pictured here we see Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf. He was Saddam's Minister of Information. He was better known here in the West simply as Baghdad Bob. He routinely denied that the Allied forces were near Baghdad despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The fall of Baghdad. Pictured here, you can see one of the statues of Saddam Hussein being pulled down, and here you can see another one where they briefly put an American flag over the face of Saddam Hussein, and they quickly realized that might be a little offensive to the Iraqi people, and so they pulled the flag down. But the Iraqi people were very elated when they pulled down the statue of the brutal dictator. So, President George W. Bush declares mission accomplished in May of 2003, creates this great photo op, lands on board an aircraft carrier. Here we got the picture of him in the flight suit. Here he is, giving the thumbs up with the mission accomplished banner in the background. But the reality is that, even though we had won the war part of the battle, the fact of the matter is we had no plan for how we were going to get out of the war, and the war drug on for quite some time afterwards and became pretty controversial as it continued to drag on. But eventually, Saddam is captured. So, at first, when it became obvious that Baghdad was kind of falling into the United States' hands, Saddam Hussein disappeared. Nobody knew his exact location. So, this happens in early 2003. Remember, Bush has declared victory, or mission accomplished, in May. But in December of 2003, Saddam Hussein was located hiding in an underground hole on a farm in Iraq. In fact, many people say he was, like hiding in basically like a rat hole. I mean, it was just a little, very small, confined little space. And this is, literally a photograph with an American service member who has got Saddam Hussein pinned down after pulling him out of the hole. And this is, once again, his scraggly appearance. This was a man who had multiple palaces, super elaborate palaces throughout the country. And then we can see what he was reduced to. So eventually he ends up being put on trial in Iraq by the Iraqi people for crimes against his own people, and he's convicted. And then on December 30th, 2006, after this prolonged trial, Saddam Hussein was executed by hanging. And of course, here you see a photograph of them putting the noose on his neck back just really shortly after, minutes after the execution. A cell phone video that wasn't supposed to be released ends up being posted to YouTube and was seen by many. The picture you see here, if you notice where the knot is, normally what they're supposed to do when they hang somebody is the knot's supposed to go behind the head so that when they drop, it snaps their neck and kills them instantly. But in this case, the rope was left more to the side, so when he dropped, it kind of more slowly strangled him. And in fact, I actually saw an autopsy photo where they had the body laying on a gurney, and you could see a gaping hole in the side of his neck where the rope was cutting through his flesh. So, with him gone, we have another problem. As I mentioned, this drug on for, even though we declared victory in May of 2003, the war, ultimately, we ended up having troops over there through 2011. And one of the major problems was what you would call insurgents or an insurgency. Former Baathists, that was the party that Saddam belonged to, and foreign terrorists. Many foreign terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda, infiltrated Iraq during this time. And they posed a problem for U.S. forces and the new Iraqi government since May of 2003, oftentimes using tactics such as roadside bombs. Finally, a coalition provisional authority is set up, which becomes an interim government that's established with Ayad Alawi as the new prime minister. But, adding to the controversy, no weapons of mass destruction were ever located, which raises the question of, why did we go in here? That was really the argument, and some critics say we went in under false pretenses, and clearly there was faulty evidence, or faulty intelligence. Controversies, once again, as I said, critics say we went to war under false pretenses. There was no UN authorization for the United States to go in there. People also claim that it distracted from the war on terror because we already were trying to hunt down Osama bin Laden in Iraq, and all of a sudden our focus had to shift, not in Iraq, but in Afghanistan, and all of a sudden our attention had to focus on Iraq. It destabilized the region, and I think there's little doubt about that now. We can see that the region has not been near as stable since then. And another criticism that critics have had is that we had no exit strategy. In other words, we had no plan for what to do after achieving victory. Were we just going to go ahead and topple their government and withdraw? That creates a very unstable situation. So instead we stayed and helped set up a new government, but then how do we get out? Especially the longer we stayed, the more we were seen as foreign occupiers, which bred resentment from many Iraqis. Another scandal, the Abu Ghraib scandal. A scandal broke after photos surfaced showing the inhumane treatment of detainees at Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad. Questions remain as to whether these were rogue soldiers or if they had been ordered to treat the detainees this way. And we really don't have any clear answers on that to this day. Democracy established. Democracy has proven complicated with a Shia Muslim majority and a Sunni Muslim minority. Concerns existed that elections could bring violence at the polls. The first elections in 2005 went smoothly. And here you can see the breakdown of Iraqis by ethnicity. They are between 75 and 80% Arab, 15 to 20% Kurdish, and about 5% a combination of Turkmen, Assyrian, and other. But by religious faith, they are 60 to 65% Shia Muslim, somewhere between 32 and 37% Sunni Muslim, and about 3% Christian and other. So, of course, when they hold elections, being that Shias are the majority, Shias usually fare quite well, as where Sunnis have a problem. But that leads to many Sunnis feeling that they're being victimized. So, U.S. withdrawal. The United States finally withdrew all of its troops in 2011. The Iraqi government now has to provide their own security, and violence is still common, as you can see here evidenced by a roadside bomb. Now we're going to move on to look at the United Arab Emirates, or the UAE. An emirate is a political territory that is ruled by a Muslim monarch. It consists of 7 states, or emirates, which are Abu Dhabi, Ajman, Dubai, Fujairah, Ras Al Khaimah, Sharjah, and Al Quwain. The government is a federal, presidential, elective monarchy. Now, the way in which this works here is that they, these different emirates are basically like states or different regions, so they have some sovereignty, but they elect, in effect, a president who are the candidates for president basically are the monarchs that rule each of these emirates. Dubai, the emirate's main sources of revenue are from tourism, property, and financial services. Now, early on, most of the money in Dubai came in from oil. And while they are a major exporter of oil, they have now shifted and found other means to draw in money, including, as I mentioned, tourism, property, and financial services. Although initial revenues, once again from oil, only 6% of the 80 billion US dollar economy comes from oil. Dubai has attracted a great deal of attention through construction projects and sporting events. This is the Burj Khalifa. Located in Dubai, the Burj Khalifa is the tallest structure ever built. It is 2,717 feet tall and 160 floors. This building is about twice the height of the Empire State Building in New York City. Turkey. Turkey lies at the boundary of Europe and Asia. It is a democratic, secular, unitary, constitutional republic, established in 1923 under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, or father of the Turks. They are increasingly integrated with the West, and they are a NATO member. Jordan. This is a constitutional monarchy with a representative government, a modern Arab nation. Its population is 92% Sunni Muslim with a small Christian minority. They are an urbanized society. Jordan is a pro-Western regime with very close ties to the U.S. and the UK. It has diplomatic relations with Israel. The only other Arab nation to do so is Egypt. Saudi Arabia, called the land of the two holy mosques in reference to Mecca and Medina, the two holiest places in Islam. Founded by Abdul Aziz bin Saud, Saudi Arabia is a monarchy ruled by the sons and grandsons of the first king. The Quran is the constitution of the country, which is governed on the basis of Sharia or Islamic law. One of the largest oil-producing nations, one of the United States' allies in the region, and many Islamic fundamentalists are upset with the Western influence over the government. And in fact, many, including Osama bin Laden, have said that they were upset by the fact that their country, Saudi Arabia, allowed the United States to use its air bases to launch an attack against an Arab neighbor, that being Iraq. Kuwait. Kuwait became independent of the UK in 1961. It is a constitutional monarchy. They were once again invaded by Iraq in 1990, leading to the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Coalition forces drove out the invaders. It is the 11th richest nation in the world per capita, meaning when you adjust for population. Now we're going to take a look at the Arab Spring. Revolution spreads through the Middle East. So really kind of a starting point here was Egypt. Once again, this had been a republic since 1953. Also was the first country to establish diplomatic relations with Israel, and has played a major role in settling disputes in the Middle East. Pictured here, you see Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak with then U.S. President George W. Bush. So now, looking at the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. On the 25th of January 2011, widespread protest began against Mubarak's regime. These took the form of an intensive campaign of civil resistance supported by very large numbers of people and mainly consisting of continuous mass demonstrations. Unrest. Minority in Cairo expressed nationalistic views against what they deemed was foreign interference, highlighted by the then-held view that the U.S. administration had failed to take sides, as well as linking the regime with Israel. Mubarak steps down. On the 11th of February 2011, Mubarak resigned and fled Cairo. Vice President Omar Suleiman announced that Mubarak had stepped down and that the Egyptian military would assume control of the nation's affairs in the short term. Jubilant celebrations broke out in Tahrir Square at the news. Mubarak may have left Cairo for Sharm el-Sheikh the previous night before or shortly after the airing of a taped speech in which Mubarak vowed he would not step down or leave. Anti-government protests have broke out in Algeria, Tunisia, Iran, Syria, Bahrain, and Libya. Now, the 2013 Egyptian Revolution. A new democratic government was established with Mohamed Morsi as the new president. Morsi was the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamic group that was formerly associated with acts of terror. In July of 2013, amidst widespread protest over his government, the Egyptian military forced Morsi from power. At present, Egypt remains in flux. Only time will tell if Egypt will form a stable government. Bahrain, a small island country with 1,234,596 inhabitants as of 2010, located near the western shores of the Persian Gulf and ruled by the Al Khalifa royal family. Bahrain is a key ally of the U.S. in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. has a fleet stationed there to provide air support to troops in Afghanistan, and to keep an eye on Iran. Unrest has spread to Bahrain as the Shiite Muslim minority remains committed to revolution. The Al Khalifa family are Sunni Muslims. Libya. Muammar Gaddafi has been the leader of Libya since 1969. He has been a sponsor of terrorism and was responsible for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. U.S. President Ronald Reagan ordered airstrikes against Gaddafi back in the mid-1980s. The Libyan Revolution. Revolts elsewhere in the Middle East have spread to Libya. Gaddafi used the Libyan military to put down the revolt. No-fly zone. The United Nations Security Council voted 10-0, with 5 nations, including Russia and China, abstaining, to impose a no-fly zone over Libya and promised military action if Gaddafi did not cease military action against protesters. The member nations cited the request of the Arab League and the African Union as reasons to get involved. Coalition action. This is an AP photo here. You see of then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on left being welcomed by French President Nicolas Sarkozy for a crisis summit on Libya at the Élysée Palace in Paris on Saturday, March 19, 2011. Britain and France took the lead in plans to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya on Friday, sending British warplanes to the Mediterranean and announcing a crisis summit in Paris with the UK and Arab allies. The Battle of Tripoli. From August 20th to August 22nd, the rebel forces gained the upper hand in the Gaddafi stronghold of Tripoli. By the end of August, the rebels had taken control of Gaddafi's compound and his family had fled to neighboring Algeria. Captured and killed. On October 20th, 2011, near Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte, he was captured and was killed. And this is a photograph of the hole that he was hiding in. And this is a still shot from a video of Gaddafi being beaten. So even in this picture, you can kind of see he's a little bloody as he's been battered and eventually was shot. Gaddafi killed. Here's a quote from Mahmoud Jabril, the interim Libyan Prime Minister, confirming the death of the former dictator. "We have been waiting for this moment for a long time. Muammar Gaddafi has been killed." Unquote. Syria. Modern Syria was created as a French mandate. It attained independence in April of 1946 as a parliamentary republic. They've had a large number of military coups. Syria has been under emergency law since 1962. The constitution has been effectively suspended and the government is not considered democratic. Government is controlled by the Ba'ath Party. After the Egyptian Revolution, protests broke out and the government of President Bashar al-Assad has violently cracked down on the protesters. Today, the country is in the midst of a civil war. The international community remains concerned about the indiscriminate use of force and the threat of chemical weapons that might have been used by the Assad regime. Several nations have supported the opposition groups, who, despite widespread calls for him to step down, Assad remains defiant. In June of 2013, the U.S. said that they had confirmed that the Assad regime had used chemical weapons against the opposition forces. The U.S. has begun to support the opposition in money and weapons.